In just 37 seconds, one of Britain's most beloved comedy legends was reduced to shouting across the loose women table, his face red with fury, before being escorted off the stage in what viewers are calling the most explosive moment in daytime television history. What started as a conversation about free speech and comedy turned into an all-out war between Rowan Atkinson and host Denise Welch, with accusations flying, voices raised, and the entire studio left in shocked silence as the Mr. Bean star stormed out, vowing never to return. Before we get into this absolute carnage, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We bring you daily videos exposing Britain's darkest scandals, the moments the mainstream media doesn't want you to see, and the confrontations that reveal who these celebrities really are behind the cameras. Last night's episode of Loose Women was supposed to be a light-hearted chat with Rowan Atkinson about his illustrious career, his upcoming projects, and perhaps a few laughs about his iconic characters. But what viewers got instead was a masterclass in how quickly things can spiral out of control when a host decides to turn an interview into an interrogation. From the moment Atkinson walked onto that stage, something felt off. The usual warm welcome, the friendly banter, the easygoing atmosphere that talk shows thrive on. It was all absent. Denise Welch sat there with a look that suggested she had an agenda, and as the cameras rolled, it became clear that this wasn't going to be the pleasant conversation everyone expected. Atkinson settled into his seat, smiling politely at the panel and the audience. He'd been on countless talk shows before, handled every kind of question with grace and wit. But within minutes, Welch launched into territory that immediately put him on edge. She started by bringing up comedy in general, asking him about the state of humor in modern Britain. Atkinson, ever the thoughtful performer, began explaining his views on how comedy has always pushed boundaries, how it's meant to make people uncomfortable sometimes, how the best comedy comes from a place of truth, even when that truth is difficult to hear. That's when Welch interrupted him, not with a follow-up question, not with genuine curiosity, but with a dismissive wave of her hand and a comment that made the entire studio tense up. She said something along the lines of how easy it must be for someone like him, a wealthy white man, to talk about pushing boundaries when he's never had to face real consequences for his words. The audience went quiet. Atkinson's smile faded. He leaned forward slightly, his voice still calm but with an edge to it now, and asked her what she meant by that. Welch doubled down. She started listing off controversies, bringing up jokes from decades ago, pulling up old interviews where Atkinson had defended comedians who'd been criticized for offensive material. She wasn't asking questions anymore. She was building a case, painting him as someone out of touch, someone who didn't understand the harm that words could cause. Atkinson listened, his jaw tightening with each accusation, and when she finally paused for breath, he responded with controlled precision. He told her that comedy wasn't about causing harm. It was about holding up a mirror to society, about making people think, about challenging the comfortable and comforting the disturbed. He said that the moment you start policing what can and cannot be joked about, you kill comedy entirely. You turn it into propaganda, into safe, sanitized nonsense that serves no purpose other than to make people feel good about themselves without ever questioning anything. His voice was steady, measured, but there was fire in his eyes. This wasn't just a professional disagreement. This was personal. Welch wasn't backing down. She shot back that free speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences, that people have a right to be offended, that comedians need to be held accountable when they cross the line. She kept using that phrase, crossing the line, as if there was some clear, universally agreed-upon boundary that everyone understood. Atkinson shook his head, clearly frustrated now, and said that's exactly the problem. Who decides where the line is? Who gets to determine what's acceptable and what isn't? Because if you give that power to anyone, they'll use it to silence the people they disagree with. The other panelists tried to jump in, tried to diffuse the tension, but Welch cut them off. She wanted this fight. She leaned across the table, her voice rising, and accused Atkinson of defending bigotry under the guise of comedy. She said that just because something is meant to be funny doesn't mean it's not harmful, doesn't mean it doesn't contribute to a culture of hate and discrimination. Atkinson's face went red, not from embarrassment, but from anger. He sat up straighter, his voice louder now. and told her she was twisting his words, putting arguments in his mouth that he'd never made. He said he'd spent his entire career trying to make people laugh, trying to bring joy to millions of people around the world, and here she was, on national television, accusing him of being some kind of hateful person because he believed in artistic freedom. He told her that comedy has always been a target for authoritarians, for people who want to control what others think and say, and that her attitude was exactly the kind of thinking that leads to censorship and oppression. Welch laughed at that. Actually laughed. She said he was being dramatic, comparing her to authoritarians just because she was calling out harmful comedy. That laugh was the turning point. Atkinson stopped trying to be polite. He told her that maybe if she'd spent more time understanding comedy, instead of trying to destroy it, she'd realize that the best humor comes from a place of love, not hate. He said that comedians like him weren't trying to hurt people. They were trying to help people see the absurdity of life, to cope with pain and suffering through laughter. But Welch wasn't interested in nuance. She kept hammering away, bringing up specific jokes, specific performances, demanding that he defend them, demanding that he apologize for them. Atkinson refused. He said he wouldn't apologize for doing his job, for making art, for believing in something bigger than the outrage of the moment. He told her that if she wanted to hold him accountable for every joke he'd ever told, then she should be prepared to be held accountable for every judgmental, self-righteous thing she'd ever said on this show. That hit a nerve. Welch's face went cold. She told him he was being disrespectful, that he was a guest on her show and he needed to watch his tone. Atkinson let out a bitter laugh and said if this was her show, then maybe she should try showing her guests some respect, instead of ambushing them with gotcha questions and moral grandstanding. The studio was electric now. You could feel the tension radiating from the stage. The audience didn't know whether to gasp or applaud. The other panelists sat there in stunned silence, clearly unsure how to navigate this absolute train wreck unfolding in front of them. Welch, realizing she was losing control of the situation, tried to pivot. She said they should take a break, that maybe everyone needed to cool down, but Atkinson wasn't having it. He said no, they were going to finish this right here, right now, because he wasn't going to let her paint him as some kind of villain just because he disagreed with her. Welch's voice turned icy. She told him that if he couldn't handle a difficult conversation, maybe he shouldn't have agreed to come on the show. Atkinson shot back that there's a difference between a difficult conversation and an ambush, and this was clearly the latter. He said she'd invited him on under false pretenses, pretending it would be a friendly chat about his career, when really she just wanted to tear him down on live television to score points with her audience. Welch denied it, said she was just asking the questions that needed to be asked, that someone had to hold powerful people accountable. Atkinson leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, and asked her who holds her accountable. Who calls her out when she's wrong, when she's being unfair, when she's using her platform to attack people who don't have the chance to defend themselves properly. Welch bristled at that. She said she was a journalist, that her job was to ask tough questions, that if he couldn't handle it, that was his problem, not hers. Atkinson shook his head and said journalists are supposed to seek truth, not push agendas. They're supposed to listen, not lecture. They're supposed to be fair, not hostile. That's when things got really heated. Welch stood up from her seat, pointing her finger at Atkinson, and told him he didn't get to come onto her show and tell her how to do her job. She said she'd been doing this for years, that she'd interviewed hundreds of people, and she wasn't going to sit there and be lectured by someone who made a career out of pulling funny faces. The audience gasped. Even the other panelists looked shocked. Atkinson's expression went from angry to absolutely furious. He stood up too, matching her energy, and said at least when he pulled funny faces, he was honest about what he was doing. He wasn't pretending to be some moral authority while tearing people down for sport. Welch told him to sit down. Atkinson refused. He said he was done, that he wasn't going to waste another second of his life being attacked by someone who clearly had no interest in an actual conversation. Welch, her voice shaking with anger now, told him that if he walked off that stage, he'd be proving her point, showing everyone that he couldn't handle being challenged. Atkinson laughed, a harsh, bitter sound, and said the only thing he'd be proving is that he had better things to do than sit there and be insulted by someone who thought they were better than everyone else. He started to take off his microphone. Welch told him he was being childish, that he was acting like a spoiled celebrity who couldn't handle criticism. Atkinson stopped, turned back to her, and said that criticism implies thoughtful analysis and reasoned disagreement. What she'd been doing was just attack after attack, twisting everything he said, putting words in his mouth, and then acting offended when he called her out on it. He told her that if she wanted to have a real conversation about comedy and free speech, he'd be happy to have it, but not like this, not with someone who'd already decided he was guilty before he even opened his mouth. Welch's face was red now too. She told him he was being ridiculous, that he was overreacting, that all she'd done was ask him some questions about his public statements. Atkinson threw his hands up in frustration and said that's exactly the problem. She couldn't even see what she'd done wrong. She genuinely believed she'd been fair, that she'd been doing her job, when really she'd spent the entire interview trying to trap him, to make him look bad, to turn the audience against him. He said it was manipulative, it was dishonest, and it was beneath her. The other panelists finally tried to step in again. One of them suggested they all take a breath, that maybe they could find some common ground if everyone just calmed down. But Welch wasn't interested in calming down. She told Atkinson that if he was so offended by her questions, maybe he should think about why that is. Maybe he should consider that she'd touched a nerve because there was some truth to what she was saying. Atkinson looked at her like she'd lost her mind. He said the only nerve she'd touched was his patience, and that was completely gone now. He told her that he'd come on the show in good faith, expecting a professional interview, and instead he'd been subjected to what felt like a public shaming. He said he'd answered her questions honestly, explained his positions clearly, and she'd responded by attacking his character, dismissing his arguments, and treating him like he was some kind of monster for believing in artistic freedom. Welch interrupted him, said he was playing the victim, that he was trying to make this about her when really, it was about his refusal to acknowledge the harm that certain types of comedy can cause. Atkinson's voice was shaking with anger now. He told her he'd never refused to acknowledge anything, that he'd spent his entire career thinking deeply about the ethics of comedy, about the responsibility that comes with making people laugh. He said he'd always tried to punch up, not down, to target power and hypocrisy, not vulnerable people. But Welch wasn't listening. She kept talking over him, kept pushing her points, kept refusing to let him finish a sentence. Finally, Atkinson actually shouted, telling her to let him bloody finish for once. The studio went silent. You could hear a pin drop. Welch looked shocked that he'd raised his voice. She told him there was no need to shout, that they were all adults here. Atkinson laughed again, that same bitter laugh, and said that's rich, coming from someone who'd been yelling at him for the past 10 minutes. He said she'd set the tone for this entire disaster, and now she was clutching her pearls because he'd finally matched her energy. Welch denied she'd been yelling, said she'd simply been passionate about the topic, that she cared about these issues deeply. Atkinson told her that passion doesn't give you the right to be cruel. It doesn't give you the right to ambush people and then act surprised when they get defensive. He said that if she really cared about these issues, she'd approach them with more empathy, more understanding, more willingness to engage with people who see things differently. Instead, she'd turned this into a witch hunt. And he was done being the witch. Welch told him he was being absurd, that he was blowing everything out of proportion, that this was just a talk show discussion and he was acting like she'd committed some great crime against him. That's when Atkinson really let loose. He told her that maybe to her this was just a talk show discussion, just another day at work, but to him this was his reputation, his legacy, his life's work being attacked on national television by someone who clearly had an axe to grind. He said she'd invited him on specifically to make him look bad, to boost her own image as some kind of social justice warrior who wasn't afraid to take on powerful men. He told her it was transparent, it was manipulative, and frankly, it was pathetic. Welch's mouth dropped open. She told him that was completely out of line, that he had no right to speak to her that way, that he was being disrespectful and aggressive. Atkinson pointed at her and said she'd been disrespectful and aggressive from the moment he sat down, but apparently that was fine because she was the host and he was just the guest. He said the double standard was unbelievable, that she could say whatever she wanted, make whatever accusations she wanted, But the moment he defended himself, he was the bad guy. The producers were clearly panicking now. You could see people in the background gesturing frantically, trying to figure out how to salvage this situation. Welch, perhaps sensing she was losing the audience, tried to soften her tone. She said maybe they'd both gotten a bit heated, that maybe they should start over, have a more constructive conversation. But Atkinson was done. He shook his head and said there was no starting over, that the damage was done. He said he'd come on the show with respect for her and the platform, and she'd thrown that respect back in his face. He finished taking off his microphone, placed it carefully on the table, and told her that he hoped she was happy with how this had gone. Because this was exactly the kind of toxic, divisive nonsense that was ruining public discourse. He said people couldn't disagree anymore without it turning into a battle, couldn't have different opinions without being accused of moral failings. And she was a perfect example of that problem. Welch tried to interrupt him again, but Atkinson held up his hand and said he was done listening to her. He told the audience he was sorry they had to witness this, that this wasn't what he'd signed up for, and that he hoped they'd understand why he couldn't stay. Then he looked back at Welch one more time and said that if she ever wanted to have a real conversation, an honest conversation, where both people were treated with respect, she knew how to reach him. But until then, he wanted nothing to do with her or her show. Welch, her voice breaking now, told him he was being unreasonable, that he was walking away from a chance to explain himself, to set the record straight. Atkinson laughed for the third time, this time with genuine disbelief. He said he'd spent the entire interview trying to explain himself, trying to set the record straight, and she'd refused to listen. He said she didn't want his explanation. She wanted his confession, his apology, his surrender, and he wasn't going to give her any of those things because he hadn't done anything wrong. He said he was proud of his work, proud of his career, and he wasn't going to let her shame him for it. With that, Rowan Atkinson turned and walked off the stage. The cameras caught every second of it, his back straight, his head held high, his face still flushed with anger. Welch called after him, told him he was making a mistake, that he was proving her point about not being able to handle accountability. But Atkinson didn't look back. He walked straight past the stunned crew members, past the shocked audience, and out of the studio doors. The sound of those doors closing echoed through the silent studio like a gunshot. Welch stood there for a moment, clearly unsure what to do next. The other panelists looked at each other, their faces a mix of shock and discomfort. The audience sat in complete silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. Then, slowly, a few people started clapping. Then a few more. Within seconds, a significant portion of the audience was applauding. Not for Welch, but for Atkinson. For standing up for himself. For refusing to be bullied. For walking away with his dignity intact. Welch's face crumpled. She tried to regain control, tried to say something about commercial breaks and continuing the show, but her voice cracked. The applause continued, growing louder, and in that moment, it was clear who the audience believed. It was clear who'd been in the wrong. Welch had pushed too hard, attacked too viciously, and it had backfired spectacularly. She'd wanted to make Rowan Atkinson look like the villain, but instead, she'd exposed herself as the bully, the aggressor, the one who couldn't handle a different opinion without trying to destroy the person holding it. The cameras finally cut away, but the damage was done. The confrontation was already spreading across social media, clips being shared thousands of times, people taking sides, debating what had happened. But one thing was clear to almost everyone who watched. Denise Welch had crossed a line that morning. She'd taken what should have been a pleasant interview and turned it into a character assassination. She'd treated a beloved entertainer with contempt and disrespect, and when he'd finally had enough, when he'd stood up for himself and walked away, she'd tried to paint him as the unreasonable one. Rowan Atkinson had left the building, but his words hung in the air long after he'd gone. Words about respect, about fairness, about the difference between criticism and attack. Words that many viewers felt applied not just to this one disastrous interview, but to the entire culture of modern media, where disagreement is treated as violence, where asking questions becomes interrogation, and where the goal isn't understanding but domination. As Welch stood on that stage, watching the doors close behind one of Britain's greatest comedic talents, she'd created a moment that would define her career, but not in the way she'd hoped. The show tried to continue. They went to commercial, regrouped, pretended everything was fine. But nothing was fine. The energy had shifted. The audience knew what they'd seen. Britain knew what had happened. And Rowan Atkinson, walking out of that studio and into the London morning, had delivered a performance more powerful than any scripted comedy bit. A real-life demonstration of grace under fire, of dignity in the face of hostility, and of the courage it takes to stand up and say enough is enough, even when the cameras are rolling and the whole country is watching.